Hi, Kathleen. It's Karen Horseman speaking, and Eva Ross is with me. We're both lawyers from the Ministry of Attorney General in British Columbia, Canada, and you're Kathleen Mackert.
Yes.
And we're sitting here today in your home in Anacortes, Washington.
Yes.
It's Thursday, June 17th of 2010. I think we're starting at around 12:15 in the afternoon. And we've talked about the fact that our interest in speaking to you today is that up in Canada we're having a reference that has to do with our criminal code prohibition on polygamy.
Yes.
And we've been interested in talking to some people who have grown up or had experiences with polygamous communities.
Mm-hmm.
And you kindly agreed to speak to us today about your experiences. And you understand that this videotape you're giving may be put before the court as evidence in our constitutional reference.
Absolutely.
So Kathleen, why don't you just begin by telling us about where you grew up and how you grew up?
Mm-hmm. I am one of 31 siblings. 27 of them were full-blooded brothers and sisters that my father had. 4 wives total, and 3 of them that he had children with. My father's name is Clyde Mackert, and my family, when I was growing up, lived in the Salt Lake Valley in various suburbs around the Salt Lake Valley. And I lived in polygamy within my family historically since the early 1800s, when polygamy was adopted by Joseph Smith and my ancestor Isaac Allred. It voted to accept it as a law of God. So for generations it's been a heritage that's been passed down to each subsequent generation. And as the generations have gone on, I feel it's become more and more abusive in its nature, and has done a lot of damage to individuals such as myself. When growing up, we were taught from the pulpit, both by the church leaders in what is now the FLDS. At that time, they were called the group. That it is acceptable to beat a child nigh unto death for direct disobedience. So we grew up in this environment where beating children was acceptable, and everyone thought that was normal. And to add to that type of abuse, which oftentimes was a belt or backhand or what have you from our father, primarily, our father was sexually abusive to myself and some of my sisters, not all of them, but some of them. I can't put a timeline accurately on the first time I was abused in that way, because it's just I was so young. And the first clear memory of it, I was around just young, about probably 5 years old, and my father forcing me to perform oral sex on him. It devastated me as a child growing up, and I felt worthless and evil and ugly from the inside out. And to the point where when I was 6 years old, I tried to kill myself by taking a whole bottle of aspirin and eating it. And it was shortly after Marilyn Monroe had died, and our father used that as an opportunity to preach the evils of suicide and drugs and the outside world. And so I became aware of the fact at a young age that if I took a bunch of pills, it might kill me. So that was my plan, because I felt that hell that I would go to for suicide was easier than the life I was living. So it's kind of hard to communicate the levels of devastation that I felt at that age, or even for some people to comprehend it. But I was willing to go to hell to be away from it. My mother checked on the children and found the smell of aspirin in the empty bottle, and the aspirin smell on my breath, and stuck her finger down my throat and emptied my stomach out, and looked at me and said, why did you do that? And I lied to her because I couldn't tell her how I felt. I was afraid how I would be treated if they knew that I tried to kill myself. So I told her that I liked the taste of it because I knew she'd believe that. So I've lived most of my life with this big dark secret that I tried to kill myself as a child, and I felt so trapped with no way out and no one to tell about what was going on with me. And so I decided that I was going to grow up and I would not try and kill myself anymore. I was going to be an adult so that I could get even. And I lived my life with thoughts of getting even with my father and killing him and all kinds of scenarios that went through my mind. And as I grew up, the abuse continued until it stopped when I was 17, when I told him demanded that he not touch me anymore because I was going to go tell the priesthood council members about it. And I just didn't care anymore. I couldn't take it. And so he stopped. But there was always the fear that if I told him he couldn't do that to me anymore, that he would hurt my younger sister the same way. So I grew up with this notion that by sacrificing myself, I was helping to keep my younger sisters safe. And I realize now that that's a common thought pattern in people that are abused by their parent figure. But it didn't keep her safe. And when I became a teenager, I observed my older sisters and their marriages. And I knew that we prepared for marriage from the age of like 14 by getting what we called a hope chest put together. And we'd put in it, make a special nightgown for our wedding night, or baby things, or supplies for the kitchen, just domestic things. And women had no plan in life other than to be a mother. And if you weren't a mother, then God was probably punishing you for some evil thing that you did. And that was the concept, that women's sole purpose was to make as many babies as they could and raise faithful children that would cling to the principle of plural marriage for the rest of their lives. And that's what women were valued for.
Is that what you were taught as part of the religious teachings?
Yes.
Of the FLDS?
Oh, absolutely. We were raised with that concept. And if you did not live plural marriage, you were not going to go to the highest degree of the celestial kingdom. So it was a mandate for everyone that eventually you would live plural marriage. So regardless of whether a person's a first wife, it was always in the plan. So I've heard some people say, well, I chose not to live it and I'm in the community. And for me, I look at that and I say, well, reality is most likely you have just not taken another wife yet, because there are many people at one time that only have one wife, and simply because they haven't been given another. And so you grow up with this concept that even if you're lucky enough to be a first wife, eventually you're going to have to share your husband with other women, and you're going to have to get used to his affections being shown to them and you being left by the wayside. And we were taught that once you couldn't have children anymore, that any intimate contact with your husband stopped, and the women would literally be put out to pasture. Well, he takes a 16-year-old or 14-year-old or whatever for a new wife and transfers those affections to her. So thoughts that you were only valued for one thing and not as a person, I felt was really damaging to me as a teenager facing marriage. and I saw my 6 older sisters who had all been married. Some of them, almost all of them but 2, were married to much older men. And our father's first daughters were twins, his first children. And one married the prophet, who at that time was Leroy Johnson. He was in his late 80s, I believe, at the time, and she was 16. So she never had any children because of his age. And her twin sister was a first wife and had many children. And so when I was a teenager, I looked at what happened to my other sisters, and I thought, this is what could happen to me, and I have no control over it. I have no control over my destiny. It's solely dependent on who I marry. And I could marry someone I didn't even know, never met before. I could marry someone I knew. I could marry someone who had many wives and was much older than me. And or I could, if you married the prophet or someone on the priesthood council members, because they had 7 members at that time, and since then it's gone to 1-man rule with Warren Jeffs, then you were elevated on nearly sainthood because of who you married, because you were so worthy to marry that righteous man. So who you married was often a sign of your value within the religious community, or within the group, I should say more accurately.
And so, Kathleen, your dad was Clyde Mackert.
Yes.
And your mom was Myra?
Myra.
And so you'd said that Clyde had 4 wives. Where did Myra fit?
Myra was his 3rd wife, and her sister was his 2nd wife. Donna was his 2nd wife. So many women will marry, sisters often marry the same man. And I even have a sister that's my age who was reassigned to a man, and her daughter and her married the same man. Her daughter married her stepfather, and who was now my sister's husband. And it gets confusing trying to explain that, how a daughter and a mother could be married to the same man. But that concept, to me, I can't imagine sharing someone I love with my daughter. It just feels evil to me to comprehend that. And yet, in their minds, they're saying this man's a good man and he's loving and he'll be good to her, and I want my daughter to be happy. So you can see how they rationalize something that to anyone else feels very repulsive. Even to comprehend that a mother and a daughter would be married to the same man, it just, you can't, it's beyond most people's imagination. I saw my sister Rena be married off to someone who she hated, and he hated her. And I saw that traumatize her. She became this robotic person who just was broken. And she used to be so full of life and rebellion and spirit, and it broke her. And it terrified me. And from that time on, I started having nightmares about heaven. And that sentence just sounds funny to even say it. But the concept of heaven for women is that for eternity, you will bring forth spirits and give birth to them, these spirit babies that will populate an entire world with you and your husband when you're gods and goddesses. And God and goddesses, I should say, with your sister wives. And that you won't have to be pregnant for 9 months, and it won't be a painful birth, but you just keep making babies to populate an entire world. And so I had these nightmares of being strapped into a breeding stall and being impregnated for all eternity with no affection, no love, just a physical act of impregnating. And we had a farm, and so I knew about breeding cattle, and that's how it manifested in my dream, these fears of never being shown love and affection, and just making babies. And I would plead to be let go, and I would see all my sister wives going through the same thing, and wake up in a cold, horrified sweat. And that was what it was like for me anticipating marriage.
Did you think of talking to your mom about your fears?
No, because anything that my mother told me about marriage only was the religious indoctrination just being restated for me, that this is your purpose, this was what you were born to do, is to populate the earth with righteous spirits.
And if you had questions about that, or were you allowed to question that?
I didn't feel close to my mother at all because I was the fourth of 7 children that she had, and she clearly in her marriage had problems with our father and the way he did things, and him keeping her from showing love. As an infant, she told me this story about when I was a toddler, and I crawled a lot and climbed a lot, and I could climb upstairs at a very young age, climb out of my crib. I was just a climber. And the steep stairs at my grandmother's house that she was afraid I would fall down and crack my head on, I never fell, and they couldn't keep me off of them because I loved to climb. Well, she went back to work when I was still very young, and my father's second wife, Donna, babysat her children while she worked. And our family was very proud that we never went on welfare, so that many of the women worked to support the large number of children and the financial burden that would create. So our mother didn't have a lot of time to enjoy her babies when she had them. And so she would go to work and travel to get to work and then drive back home. She'd leave before I was awake in the morning and come home after I was put to bed. So I would never see her. So as a toddler, I stayed up in my crib, and when I heard my mother come home, I would crawl out of my crib to go see her. And I wanted to be loved by my mother, and our father caught her rocking me in the rocking chair and loving me when I was supposed to be in bed. And he scolded her, saying that I needed to be taught to obey and stay in bed when it was bedtime. And he instructed her to spank me and put me back in bed. So she did what he said, even though it broke her heart, and she wanted nothing more than to rock her baby and show me love. And 13 times she spanked me and put me back to bed because I was so stubborn and I just wanted my mother. And she did it because she said she knew that I needed to learn to obey. And this is how the women are kept from loving and nurturing their children. This is the dynamic. And so I grew up not being connected with either my mother or my father, emotionally, psychologically, no bond with either one of them. And the only contact I had with my father felt abusive. And I was terrified as a young child. Preschooler, I used to hide down the hallway every time father came, and mother it bothered him. He was like, I don't know why she's so terrified of me. And I used to hide under the kitchen table and want to disappear. I wanted to erase myself because I just didn't want to be there. And it took me a long time, and I really started to blossom when we all moved together because we had a bond with our siblings that helped us survive. And
so originally you were living in separate houses?
Yeah, they lived in separate houses when I was young because after the 1953 raid in Short Creek, which is now Colorado City and Hilldale, Utah, my father was arrested in that. He was treated as a hero. He used to be a school teacher, and they stripped him of his teaching degree, and he fought a legal battle to regain his teaching degree. So we lived in separate houses in different parts of the valley, the 3 mothers at the time, and my mother and her children had a fake last name, which was actually our father's middle name, which was Chapman. And so I grew up feeling illegitimate on top of everything else. And because I couldn't even use my father's real name. And there was this feeling that if you slipped and used the wrong last name, or you told somebody by mistake, what was really going on, that our father would go to jail and it would be your fault. So I grew up feeling that I was responsible for whether my father stayed out of jail or not, whether I could lie to people well enough and just tell them he's a traveling salesman and that's why he's not around, and, lie about our last name and just all these lies we were taught to tell to keep him from going to jail. So that was a big fear. And on top of that, there was the fear of the destructions, which was taught to us that God was going to cleanse the earth of all the evil people and only the righteous saints would survive. And that literally blood would run down the streets of Salt Lake Valley and human body parts, and only the priesthood, power of the priesthood, would keep us safe. So if you can imagine what it might have been like for a young child to hear these kinds of things taught on a regular basis, to grow up in an environment of fear. The fear of, am I going to be righteous enough to be saved, or is God going to kill me? And I didn't feel righteous because I felt so wicked because of what Father was doing to me. So I grew up with this fear of being destroyed by God, destroyed by what my father was doing to me. Just a lot of fear, more than any child should have to endure. And fear of the outside world and how evil those people were, and if you came in contact with them, you'd somehow become tainted. And so I grew up with no friends and no social connection, and we weren't allowed to have friends at school, and we had no Christmas, and the birthday celebration was simply us singing a birthday song. Early in my life, my mother used to do a cake, but then Father stopped that. So I remember one year I was given a Christmas tree at school because they had this giveaway, and I ended up being the student who won the free live Christmas tree. And when it was delivered, my father put it along the side of the house and let it die. And I used to go out there and sit by that Christmas tree and wish I could have a normal childhood like all the other kids. And just watched it die, and it felt like I was dying inside along with it. Sorry, I'm so emotional.
No, it's you let me know if you want to have a break.
Yeah.
At any time, Kathleen, okay?
Okay. So back to when I was approaching marriage, I couldn't talk to my mother, as we discussed. Anybody that I talked to would ridicule me for these fears, that I didn't have enough faith. I should have faith in God to pick the right husband for me, that I don't have the knowledge or the insight of who I have made covenants in the pre-existence to marry, and I should trust God to do that. But I didn't have a lot of trust because I'd seen what it did to my sister Rena with her marriage, which was, I believe, was punishment for her being so rebellious. She went through life. She was one of the most beautiful young ladies in all of the group. And so she went through life being rebellious so she wouldn't be appealing to the prophets and the leaders, because she didn't want to marry an older man. So she thought if she was too much to handle, this is what she's told me, that they wouldn't want to marry her. So I saw that as a defense mechanism, but then she got punished by marrying someone that she hated, and he hated her. And that was her stepbrother.
Did you have any choice in who you were going to marry?
No. We were always taught that if it was simply to accept this is what you chose before you were born, and that was when your choice was.
So was it the prophet who would tell you who you were going to marry?
And the prophet would tell our father when he had a revelation, and our father would deliver that message. And I saw a pattern in our family, and since then, in reading other survivors' books, I've seen the same pattern of waking girls up at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning to tell them when they're in the deepest part of their sleep, and recognize that that's a tactic that's used to control people. And the same thing was done to me. I was awakened at 2:30 or 3 o'clock in the morning out of a deep sleep and told to come up to Father's den, and I didn't know what was going on, whether he was going to sexually abuse me again or I was being punished. I could not imagine what was going on, and it was just a terrifying way to be awakened. And got up there, and as I walked up the stairs, I saw the door open and all of my 4 mothers sitting in the den, and they were smiling, and I knew then that they were going to tell me who I was going to marry. And I was terrified because I didn't know who it was going to be.
How old were you at this time, Kathleen?
I was just a week past 17 and considered an old maid at that age, and my brothers teased me that no one wanted me, and I was never going to get married because I was so old. And actually, I correct that. It was a week after my 18th birthday. I'm sorry, I'm kind of emotional right now. So I walked in there and I sat down, and they had a chair in the middle of the room, and I just was numb and could hardly move or speak. And Father announces that Uncle Roy, President Johnson, the prophet at the time, has had a revelation on who I'm to marry. And I just sat there, numb and paralyzed with fear. And he finally said, well, don't you want to know who it is? And I just nodded my head and said, yeah, like that's all I could muster to respond. And he said, Daniel. And I was trying to figure out, because there's so many Daniels, I couldn't imagine who it was. And then he said Daniel Swaney, and he was my stepbrother, as the son of my father's 4th wife from a previous marriage. He was nearly 10 years older than me, but he wasn't married, and he came from the outside world, so he got away with doing things his way instead of towing the party line all the time. And he was always kind, and he was young and good looking. And
so his mom had been a convert to the FLDS?
Yes, he was in the Air Force and came on leave. The first time I met him, I was 10 years old, and he was 19. And I remember him in his dress uniform, and I'd never seen anybody in a uniform before, and I was just fascinated. And he was stationed in Hawaii, and he had this dark tan, and he just didn't look like any person I'd ever seen. And he played with the kids outside. He was swinging us around by the arms, and I remember him playing with me like an older person, an adult would play with a child. And to think that and we were all living in one house, and we were instructed when Father married his mother, which her name was Maureen, that they were our brothers and sisters, her children, and we were to treat them as such. So psychologically, for me to go from one day he's my brother to the next day he's my husband was just really hard for me to wrap my mind around. It felt psychologically abusive, even though I knew he was the best of all possible people they could have given me, because I'd have more freedom with him than I would. I'd be a first wife. I knew him. I knew he was kind. all of these pluses. It's like you go through a checklist in your mind of things that are good so that you can accept it and not really realize how traumatizing that is to marry your stepbrother. And in my mind, there was no step. He was my brother. I treated him the same way I treated my other brothers. And so in one respect, I consider myself very lucky. It wasn't a punishment like my sister Rena's marriage. I didn't disappear like my older sister Mary when she got married, and we didn't see or hear of her for years. And I didn't marry an old man and not be able to have children. I didn't, have to share him with anyone at that point. And there were so many reasons why I felt lucky that it took me a long time to realize how devastating that really was, to just be told who you're marrying and make that transition in my mind from brother to husband.
How long was it between the time that you were woken up that night, Kathleen, and when the marriage actually took place?
A week. I was given a lot more time than my sisters. Usually the marriage would happen the next day after they're told, sometimes right after they're told. So in many ways, I was treated in a better way than most of my sisters. So it was almost hard for me to feel like it was hard to do, because considering the other sisters and what they went through, I was given a lot more time to adjust. And it was easier in a lot of ways because I knew him. I knew him so well. But even looking back on my wedding photo, we're both looking at each other like we're terrified. And how bizarre and uncomfortable it was to make that transition. And I was so glad that he was kind and worldly.
Did you think at the time that it would have been open to you to say, no, I'm not ready to get married yet? Or
It's funny that you asked that, because I sat there just thinking through all this checklist of pros and cons and ways that I was lucky, and trying to wrap my mind around it. And my father said, is that okay with you? And I'm like thinking to myself, why is he even asking me that? Because I know I don't have a choice. And I just went, yeah. I was like shocked that he even asked that question, because that's not what we were taught. That my sister Rena was never asked that. I don't know of any woman that was asked if that was okay with them. So everything just felt different, and I felt lucky for so long that it took a while to really see how damaging it was. And the damage came out later on in our marriage, because it ended up being the root of why we divorced, because our marriage wasn't based on love. And it was like building a house with a very shaky foundation, and you can only build it so high before it crumbles. And so I was so lucky, though, to marry him, because of who I married, I was able to get free with all of my children. We left with our entire family intact. He would come back from the monthly priesthood meetings so upset, and we lived apart from the community because he'd graduated from the University of Utah with a master's degree in mechanical engineering. So he'd been given permission by the leadership to live wherever his job required. So I lived in the outside world, but lived separate from them, and I still trying to maintain that isolation. So I remained pure and untainted by the Gentiles, as we were taught to call them.
Where were you living with Danielle?
When we first got married, we lived in a small town in central Utah called Monroe, Utah, and he worked for U.S. Gypsum Company. And then at that time I had 4 miscarriages in a row, and I thought God was punishing me because I couldn't have a baby. And one of them I carried to 5 months and gave birth to a dead baby. And I thought that I was being punished because of what Father did to me. And I went into a really, really deep depression. And I ate a lot. I gained like 40 pounds in 1 month, just trying to cope with everything. And finally we got a good doctor that found out that it was just a thyroid imbalance, and he fixed that, and I was able to have my first child. And because I struggled so much to have babies, I think I valued them more. I saw women and sisters have a baby every year, and when women would lose a baby in death, you'd hear women say, I would hear women say, you know, hope that God would bless them with another baby. And that always sat wrong with me. Like, how can you replace a child with another? I wouldn't want to. You can't replace a puppy with a different puppy. They're not the same. You still have that loss, and I couldn't understand it. But I feel like because I struggled so long, 4 years of my first 4 years of my marriage to have a baby, that when I did get them, I valued them more. And I wanted to be the best mother in the world. And I studied parenting books and child development and tried to learn how to be a good mother, and formed my own opinions on what good parenting is, because I didn't want to repeat the mistakes that I'd seen growing up. I wanted my children to feel loved and important and valued.
Did Daniel have a second wife?
No, he never took a second wife, and I don't believe he ever wanted to, because before as a young man in our family, as my brother, he used to say that he only wanted 2 children because the world's overpopulated, and he would talk about that, and we'd look at him like he was an alien. So you can see the kind of strong will that he had in his own concepts, and he'd talk about evolution, and our mothers would get very upset. And so he was somebody who didn't naturally conform. He was an educated person who looked at things through educated eyes and not just accept them as face value. So he would come home. I eventually had 4 children, and when he would come home from priesthood meeting, they'd have a men's priesthood meeting every month, once a month on a Saturday, and he'd drive to Salt Lake and come back, and they were sworn to secrecy, not to talk about the things that were discussed in that meeting. So he would come back obviously upset and agitated, and I didn't understand why, and I would try to talk to him about what was wrong, and he all he would say was, I just cannot believe the things that they're teaching. I cannot accept them. And he wouldn't tell me what it was, but it just upset him so much. So I had neighbors that had shown me a lot of love and acceptance in a Mormon community. We lived in a small little cul-de-sac in Thatcher, Penrose, Utah, and they had come over and welcomed me to the neighborhood and been very kind, and my eyes had been opened that these people are not evil. In fact, some of them showed me more love than some of my own family members. And so I used the opportunity, my daughter was 9 years old at the time, to tell him, well, let's leave. We don't have to accept what they're teaching, and I don't want to live like this anymore. And I don't want my daughter to be given away to somebody she doesn't love or know. And that thought just terrified me because I loved her so much. And So he looked at me and said, well, she's only 9 years old. We don't have to make this decision now. And I said, but if we don't get away now, she'll be so indoctrinated that we may not be able to get her away. And he saw the wisdom in that, and he agreed. So we just stopped going to see them, and we stopped going to meetings, and finally my father eventually called and had a stern conversation with him, but they left us alone because we left together as a whole family. I knew that if I had tried to leave him, if he wanted to stay, that it would be a struggle even getting my children away from the group, because we're taught that the children don't belong to the mothers, they belong to the men, they belong to the priesthood, because they were born under the covenant of plural marriage. So women grow up feeling and believing, I grew up feeling and believing that I didn't even have a claim to my own children in the eyes of God. So, but by that time, my concept of God had been pretty corrupted. I grew up feeling like if God could let these evil things happen to innocent children, then how could he be so good? How could he let this happen to me, to my sisters? And so I hated God for a long time. So after I left, it took me a long time to reconstruct my concept of God and accept God as being a loving person, a loving entity that cares about me. So on top of the psychological, physical, emotional abuse, there was spiritual abuse, because so much of what was done to me was done in the name of priesthood and God. So after we stopped going, my husband said, we've got to teach our children some God concepts so they'll be good people, some sense of religion. What are we going to teach them? So we decided to, since he was born into Mormonism as a young child, and the community was predominantly Mormon, and they'd been so good to us that it was so similar to what I'd been raised with, that we joined the Mormon church there. And were accepted by the community. It was a beautiful time to feel like I belonged, and that sense of losing all of my family members when I left, and contact with them was really traumatic. So that sense of belonging and fitting in to any kind of social niche has always been a struggle. And there's times to this day where I don't feel like I belong anymore. That just sense of isolation, and since my divorce, it's been difficult. I've seen my sister Rena be drawn to one abusive marriage after another, and I didn't want to be like that. So I was emotionally shut down in a lot of ways, and attracted to men that would be unavailable if for one reason or another, geographically, emotionally, maybe they were married and lying to me. That's happened. And so I have trouble with intimate relationships, and since then I've studied a lot about things. I've been through therapy that's helped a lot. My first therapist told me I was so strong to have survived what I went through, and I didn't feel strong at all when she told me that. And then she pointed out all the ways that I was, and it made me feel like a survivor instead of a victim. And I struggled with suicidal thoughts even after my children were born, until I got into therapy. And that's why I started therapy, because I was so overwhelmed with panic attacks and depression and suicidal thoughts, and I couldn't get a grip on it. I mean, I couldn't function. I would literally curl up on my bed in fetal position, and my body hurt from what I was going through, emotionally and psychologically. So against my husband's wishes, I started therapy. And it changed everything. And in some ways, he blamed it for destroying our marriage, but I was stuck, and I had to grow as a person. I had to get past the abuse that I experienced and heal myself and learn to love myself. And I didn't have a choice. It was either that or kill myself, and I didn't want to damage my children with that. I loved them too much. So my children saved me, because I know without them I would have not have wanted to live. There would have been no reason to not kill myself. And I would have like overwhelming urges to just pull the car in front of a semi-truck and just kill myself that way, and no one would know. But every time my children and thoughts of what it would do to them and what their life would be like if I did that, that stopped me from doing it. So that started my road down to healing with therapy. And I struggled at that time because I had lost a lot of weight after my last baby was born. And men would whistle at me or eye me up and down or smile or tell me I was beautiful, and it would trigger all these thoughts from my childhood and my father sexually abusing me and him telling me how pretty I was and beautiful I was. And I just would panic when that would happen, and it created all these suicidal thoughts and panic and depression because I was getting that kind of attention. So for a good part of my life, I would hide behind being heavier, and when I'd lose the weight, I'd get that attention, and it'd be hard for me to accept. So I struggled with that, and finally ended up conquering that. There's still things that trigger eating disorders in me, but I studied something called reactive attachment disorder that the Mayo Clinic has written about. And reading the signs of it and the symptoms, I saw so much of myself and some of my siblings and even my mother in it. And realizing that when children are raised by a community that's called family, like I was, where I wasn't nurtured by my mother so much as my older siblings, my mother's sister wives, and passed around to be taken care of by other people, so many other people than my mother, that it creates this inability to connect intimately with people. And I feel that that's why I still struggle with intimate relationships. It's difficult to feel like you've healed yourself on one level, and then you uncover something else that you need to work on, and it feels like it's a lifetime effort to rebuild. But one thing that I did right was get my children out, and thank God, they don't know what it was like to be raised the way I was. It's foreign to them. And they live a happy life that's full of freedom and choice and personal responsibility for what you do with your life and control over that, individual control over your own life. And so I rejoice in their freedom to be able to choose who they love and who they marry and where they live and what they wear and how they wear their hair and whether they wear makeup or just, I could go on and on, what they eat. When I was 18, I was taken to a restaurant and I panicked because I couldn't figure out what I wanted to order to drink with my breakfast. And then I was ridiculed for choosing a Coke to go with my pancakes. So
Because you weren't used
I
to
wasn't
exercising
allowed to
choice.
exercise choice at all. And just being given a choice when I'd never been given one at 18 years old created such a panic in me.
Mm-hmm. Do you still find it difficult now, Kathleen, to make decisions and to exercise choice?
No. I've
That's something you've
conquered
got
that one.
past.
I've gotten past that. I've gotten to where I really enjoy the choice, because it was so taken away from me. And I felt growing up like I was a sex slave, because that's the only thing I was valued for, was being impregnated and making babies. And
Now, I know you're living now with your sister Rena in
Mhm.
Anacortes,
yes.
and I know both of you feel quite strongly that polygamy should be stopped as a
Yes.
practice. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about the work you and your sister have been doing.
Well, we formed together a nonprofit called the Valerie Jeffs Mackert Gateway to Freedom, and it's a memorial to our brother Stan's wife Valerie Jeffs, and she was Warren Jeffs' sister, and she married our younger brother, and she was sexually abused between the ages of 10 and 13 by 3 of her brothers, and she named Warren as being one of those. And she and our brother Stan, left polygamy together, but she struggled to fit in and to heal herself. And so she vacillated with going back and trying to fit in there, and going back and trying to fit in the real world. And she used drugs as a coping mechanism, which is something that I've seen in other survivors. That wasn't my particular coping mechanism, because I didn't want to lose control. I don't like feeling out of control. So mine was more suicidal thoughts and things like that. But it's a pattern where people can, my therapist explained that people who've been through and survived the kinds of things that I have, they tend to use things, coping mechanisms. It can be alcoholism or drugs or any kind of addiction. They become attract an addictive personality. And so that's something I've tried to watch out for, something that I witnessed with my sister Rena and her struggles that nearly cost her her life. And so being someone who hid under the kitchen table and observed, I grew up being an observer, and in my effort to be invisible. So I avoided a lot of those things, but Valerie did not. And she had grand mal seizures her whole life, and she died clean and sober at the age of 40, and her heart gave out, and it's our belief that all the drugs that she did damaged her heart, when she had a seizure, and cost her life. And for us, we believe that part of that blame is on polygamy, because if she had not been through all that and used those drugs to cope with life, then she wouldn't have been damaged in that way, and she might still be with her children today. And she was a very loving, beautiful person whose smile could light up a room. And so it's in honor of her, and we reach out to help people who want to be free from polygamy. And miraculously, the first person we were able to help was our sister Paula, who we hadn't seen in over 2 decades. And we lobbied to change laws to affect the survivors so they can get the help that they need, so they don't fall through the cracks of the social network. We take on the responsibility of acquiring the proper documentation that they need, because many survivors don't have birth certificates. It becomes a real legal issue trying to document their existence when they have no imprint on society. And we also reach out to victims of domestic violence to help them, because we've identified that the same control tactics used for domestic violence are also used against women and children in polygamy, and even the young men, to control them. It's the same dynamic as domestic violence, and the same tactics are used. So that many of the same needs, they have the same needs. It's just to varying degrees. Someone who comes from polygamy or someone who comes from domestic violence. And they're isolated, both of them. They're controlled with fear and a firm, oftentimes physically violent control. And so we reach out to help anybody in those dynamics rebuild their lives and get the help that they need, so that it won't cost them their life like it did Valerie, trying to find themselves and find peace. And so that is what we do, and we're so happy to be able to be given a voice. And after I'm 52 years old, after living through all of this, to be able to have my voice be heard, it means so much. And I hope that it'll have an effect, because for over 170 years, nearly 180 years, my family has generationally lived polygamy from its very inception. It's been our heritage, passed down from generation to generation. And luckily, all of my mother's children, Myra, her children are not living polygamy. All of them have stopped, do not embrace that lifestyle. But we have many brothers and sisters who still embrace it fervently, and our family's been shattered by it. And we don't want to see another generation lost and lives destroyed through this practice. And the joy is seeing people turn their life around and regain the control and blossom and grow and become self-confident. It's so healing to see those people that are helped be able to do that, and as well as seeing our own children and our own grandchildren blossom and become the beautiful, independent people that they are, who are full of freedom and life and love. And that's the healing part of it all. And to know that women can be valued for their mind and what they can accomplish. And I had a close family in Sandy, Utah when we lived there, the Millsap family, and there was a young girl named Marta, their daughter Marta Millsap, and she was near my age, and she was so intelligent. And in Jordan High School, before they pulled us out of school, she scored in the upper 3 percentile in the entire nation on her collegiate testing as far as her intellectual abilities. And that brilliant woman who knows what she could have accomplished if she had been able to use her mind and the gifts that she was given, became a mother and had babies, and that's all. And I just couldn't imagine God or any higher power being giving a woman that much intelligence without some purpose to it. And being a mother and having children is wonderful, but I can be fulfilled on many levels as a person, including being a mother and children, and a mother and a wife, but not excluding it. I mean, our brothers had so much more freedom than we did, and we grew up in this environment that was racist and sexist, and women were degraded as almost on a property level. And we've seen that happen with some of our siblings who've been rearranged by Warren Jeffs and their families taken away from their husband and them reassigned to another man. And some of them have been removed and reassigned more than once. And I cannot imagine the fear that would go through a child's mind, not knowing whether the person you call father is going to be there tomorrow, whether you're going to be calling some stranger father and be totally removed from your family and reassigned to someone else that you don't even know and be told to call him father. The way I was raised was damaging enough with my father, with not getting that kind of nurturing and loving, and just, even if the man is good and loving and wants to be a good father, just the sheer mathematics of it, it's impossible to nurture and give that many children what they need and deserve growing up. It's just impossible. So the hope is that we can affect a change. Even if we change one life, it changes all the generations to come for that person, their children, the children, their children's children. So we want to influence people with love and choice and options, and give them the help they need so that they don't suffer like Valerie did. So that's what we're doing now, and I'm really happy to know that my children are beginning to understand what I went through to give them the lives that they have now. And to get that recognition from them is very, very healing. And we're working to heal some of the damage that's been done to our family, and striving to reconnect with our loved ones, our siblings, and mothers that we walked away from when we walked into freedom, and try and heal the damage that's been done in the name of God and religion. So it's a good place to be in life now, and it's hard to talk about these things, and I know I've been really emotional, but I don't no longer feel like a victim. I feel like a survivor. I feel like an empowered woman who has choices and options and the ability to reach out and give others a hand, a helping hand in healing themselves and rebuilding their life. And that in and of itself is very rewarding on many, many levels.
Well, we very much appreciate your time today, Kathleen.
Thank you.
I think we're done.